We're here today to announce a bill we introduced yesterday about saving our sequoias. And this cone right here is the giant sequoia. These wonders live for thousands of years. And in their natural habitats, the only way they die is they become so large they topple over. You know, prior to 3 years ago, the only historical record we had of a fire destroying a giant sequoia was in 1297. But in the last 3 years, 20% almost of the giant sequoias have been destroyed by fire. They become so intense. The management practices and others. And when you think about these, the thousands of years that they have survived, to lose 20% just in 3 years, if we do nothing, we can lose them all. Giant sequoias are native to my district. In fact, 61 groves are located there. The remainder are located in Tom McClintock's district. That's why earlier this year, you see a bipartisan group behind me. And I've got to tell you one thing. I have great respect for everybody on this. We may disagree on others. This isn't a bill that people got together in Washington and wrote. People on the stage got together and traveled to literally witness and inspect the groves. We sat with all stakeholders. We listened, be it the Native Americans, the Forest Service, everyone that has a stake in the game. And I will tell you, walking away as we traveled in the van together, looking at these trees that were charred, looking at trees that were destroyed, and knowing that they just can't come back in one more year, that we could not sit back and do nothing. We knew both sides are going to have to give something, and this is only focused on the groves for the giant sequoias, not for anywhere else in the forest. Because if we do nothing, there will be none left. And you have to think of the majesticness of this tree. When you talk about a giant sequoia, people picture it. They talk about the times that they may have traveled there as a child. Our amusement park builds an artificial one. The U.S. Forest Service even uses this emblem of a giant sequoia on their patch and their badge. It is that beautiful and that much of the American heritage of where it is. To express how urgent this matter is, I want to share a few facts with you. 85%. That's the percent of giant sequoia groves that burned between 2015 and 2021. 85% of the groves burned. Almost 20% are wiped out. And again, remember, the only place on record prior to that to a giant sequoia dying from a fire was 1297. In comparison, only 25% of the giant sequoia groves have previously burned in the last century. So you have 85% burned in the last 6 years, but in the last century, there was only 25%. So something has to change. The numbers are pretty alarming. I think that's what's brought this group together. Each of them have certain expertise. Each of them have a love and respect for nature and want to maintain it. Each of them have a desire to save the giant sequoias. So we look to finding common sense reforms for the Forest Service management, ways that we can protect, and ways that we can come together. This is a crisis, and it must act on it now to ensure that we save them for future generations. With that, I want to introduce Congressman Scott Peters, who came and went on the tour, has a lot of expertise to make sure he protects the environment. I want to thank him for his work on there, and I want to thank him for his desire to save the giant sequoia.
Thanks very much. Today is a defining moment for wildfire policy in America. We cannot stand by as wildfires destroy communities, decimate forests, and spew toxic pollution into the air. And we can't stay in our partisan corners while frontline communities suffer. Republicans and Democrats are coming together to chart a better path forward, starting today with the giant sequoias. Over 20 members of Congress, are joining Leader McCarthy and me to introduce the Save Our Sequoias Act. And as representatives of California's 23rd and 52nd districts, we know this issue better than most folks in Washington, D.C. I appreciate Leader McCarthy and Ranking Member Westerman's collaboration on this important bill. And if you're looking for an example of committed bipartisanship in these times, this is it. Giant sequoias are world-renowned for their majestic size and ancient lifespan, reaching heights over 300 feet, living for thousands of years. Teddy Roosevelt perhaps said it best when he called the Mariposa Sequoia Grove a temple greater than any human architect could ever possibly build. Historically, sequoias have been fire-resistant. The last significant loss of a sequoia, as Leader McCarthy said, from fire, was over 750 years ago. But decades of inadequate forest management, combined with worsening drought and rising temperatures, have created an environment that is killing these trees at an alarming and unprecedented rate. In just 2 years, catastrophic wildfires have decimated 19% of all giant sequoias. Scientists tell us that we have a narrowing window of opportunity to protect the remaining trees, and if we fail to act, we could lose the giant sequoia forever within the coming decades, in the next 25 years. In May, I visited Sequoia National Forest with Leader McCarthy and Representatives Westerman, Costa, Valadeo, and Pineda. We saw the destruction from recent fires in Sequoia National Forest, and we marveled at the remaining healthy trees. We met with community members, the Tule River Tribe, Save the Redwoods League, local mill owners and cattle ranchers. To name a few, we heard loud and clear that immediate action is required. Community members are demanding new funding, tools, and authorities to protect the remaining trees and their communities. The Save Our Sequoias Act, or SOS Act, delivers on these issues. After months of negotiation and engagement with land managers, environmentalists, industry representatives, tribal partners, state and local officials in California, and Sequoia experts, we've crafted a comprehensive bipartisan bill that meets the scale of the crisis. Specifically, the bill equips land managers with the resources and tools needed to rapidly implement massive forest restoration projects. It enhances coordination between federal, state, tribal, and local land managers, creates a giant sequoia health and resiliency assessment to inform forest management projects and study giant sequoia health and resiliency, provides new funding to support forest restoration projects, and declares an emergency in the sequoia groves to proactively implement sequoia protection projects and maintain sound environmental analysis. This bill, this bipartisan bill, gives us the best chance to save the remaining giant sequoias. It's received robust local and national support, including from the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. We work closely with the governor's people on this. The Tule River Tribe, Save the Redwoods League, Tulare County, National Park and Forest Foundations, the grassroots wildland firefighters. In addition to protecting the giant sequoias, the bill will also further our rural development and climate goals. To stop severe fires, we need to create and maintain good-paying jobs, restoring forests, utilize forest residue removed from forests, and fighting inevitable fires. Rural communities need our support so they can establish sustainable circular economies with forest management and wildfire resilience at the core. With climate change driving more extreme fires, the fires themselves are now fueling more rapid warming by releasing carbon dioxide and superpolluting black carbon into the atmosphere. In 2020, California wildfires released more carbon emissions than the state's entire power sector releases in a year. For sequoias specifically, which this bill is about, this is just about sequoias, the trees rank second to coastal redwoods in their ability to absorb carbon dioxide. We have to restore our forests so they remain key allies in the fight against climate change rather than drivers of it. If we fail to invest in our forests, we will lose the giant sequoia, we will lose the Yosemite Valley, and likely lose the forests in the southern Sierras. To me and the group of stakeholders who contributed to and support this legislation, that's not acceptable. Let's reject this status quo. Let's move forward, come together to save the sequoias. Anything less would be a tragedy, both for the iconic giant sequoias and our ability still to overcome challenges in America. With that, I want to thank Leader McCarthy, who, as he said, represents the territory where most of these trees are, and also my friend Bruce Westerman, who will tell you he's the only conservative at the Yale School of Forestry, where he got his degree. He's got a master's degree in forestry. He's a great resource to Congress and to California. He came from Arkansas to California on our trip. Has been really helpful in figuring out, helping us with the science. Also, my colleagues here, Mr. Panetta and Mr. McClintock. This is a great day, and really appreciate the support. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Scott. And I'll be the first to say that without Scott Peters' work and help, we wouldn't be here today. And I think this is not just a good day for Sequoias, but it's a good day for America. It's a good day for Congress, where we can come together and show how Congress should really work on very important issues. When we're talking about Sequoiadendron giganteum, or giant sequoia, the most iconic tree on the planet, I would dare say. And it's not just iconic in the sense of a tree, it's also iconic in the sense that it ranks right there with the Statue of Liberty, the Grand Canyon, Mount Rushmore, and our sequoia groves. If you've never had a chance to visit one of these places, you're truly missing a great piece of Americana. But as I reflect on what we saw and what's happening when we look at the science and the data with our giant sequoias, I think about what Henry Ford said when he said, failure is an opportunity to begin again more intelligently. And we have to realize the fact that we failed. We failed because, as others have mentioned, we've lost nearly 20% of these iconic trees just in the past few years. There's only one place in the world that these trees grow. They grow on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevadas in very defined groves. That's good in the sense of when you're looking at legislation, because you can focus specifically on these groves, and this legislation targets these groves. You might ask, what's happening in the giant sequoia groves? That's what I ask. A couple of decades ago, when I was in forestry school, if you had told me that an entire grove of sequoia trees would be wiped out by wildfire, I would think you were crazy. I think most people would have said, you're crazy, that can't happen. These trees have bark that's up to 2 feet thick. Some of the big ones do. They've been around for 3,000 years. Some of these trees have. They've survived a lot of fire. So what happened? Why are we here today? Where did we fail? And if you look at the research, you find out that we thought we were doing the right thing. We thought we were helping these groves. We were putting the fires out when they started, but the research shows that for centuries, there were an average of 31 fires per century in these groves until the 20th century, when Native Americans, right after the gold rush in California, they quit doing controlled burns in the groves, and then the Forest Service was established around the turn of the century, and we just started putting the fires out. So for an entire century, the 20th century, there were an average of 3 fires. We went from 31 to 3 in the groves in California. So what happened in those 100 plus, nearly 150 years of no fire in the sequoia groves? Well, there's a tree called a white fir. It's a shade-intolerant tree, which means it can grow up in the shade. It doesn't need sunlight, grows very slowly. And over 100 years, these trees grew up, and the tips of them got into the lower crowns of the giant sequoias. And it's not the low-burning fires around the base of the trees that kill them. It's when the fire climbs up the white fir, when it climbs up pine trees, and it gets up into the crowns, and you have these crown fires that are stand replacing. It takes these trees out, and it's heartbreaking. It's one of the saddest things I've ever seen was to walk out in the Alder Creek Grove and see a moonscape with giant sequoia snags in it. And we can do better than that. That's why we're here today, is because we're going to do better. We're going to come together as Congress. We're going to push this issue. It's very specific to 2 congressional districts in California, but it is important to our whole country. I'm from Arkansas, a long ways from California, but these groves have a lot of special meaning to me and to all Americans. So I'm thrilled that we're here today working on bipartisan legislation, that we went to the communities where we visited with the local experts. There are 4 different people that have, if you want to call it ownership in these groves. You got the Park Service, the Forest Service, the state of California, and the Tule River Tribe that has sequoia groves. So we're trying to bring everybody to the table, get input, have a very focused goal specifically on these sequoia groves, and we're going to make a difference here. I bragged about Scott. I can't say enough good things about his leadership, but we've also got my friend Jimmy Panetta, also from California, who's passionate about these issues. He went on the field trip with us, and he's been right there the whole time working. And I can tell you, as a Republican, I don't catch flack for wanting to do forest management. But there are groups that try to put pressure on these guys, and you're barking up the wrong tree if you're trying to put pressure on Scott Peters and Jimmy Panetta and Jim Costa and all the other Democrats that are signing onto this bill. This is something we can work together on, that we can make a difference on, and I'm honored to turn the microphone over to Jimmy Panetta.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Westerman. And also thank you, Leader McCarthy, and Mr. Peters, Representative Peters, Representative McClintock, but also all of the 14 Democrats and 14 Republicans that are on this bipartisan bill. Many of you probably are not from California, so many of you don't realize just how absolutely dry it is in literally every single part of California. The conditions of our forests have reached record levels of dryness, a dryness that consists of layers and layers of dry trees, sticks, leaves, grass, you name it. And it creates vast swaths of wilderness that are flammable, ignitable, combustible, making them so vulnerable that they can absolutely explode with just a single spark, a simple down power line, a smoldering campfire, or just one single strike of lightning. These are forests that are so filled with fuel, that are so dry, that they can get so hot that it can wipe out not just trees, but the world's largest trees. We saw that recently in the visit that you heard about to Sequoia National Park. We saw how colossal, yet how fragile the giant sequoias can become, not because of the trees themselves. You heard Bruce talk about how magnificent, how strong, how sturdy they are. But it's about the fuels around the sequoias that make them so susceptible to being destroyed. And that is why we must act now. That's why I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of the Save Our Sequoias Act, to save these ancient, magnificent trees by using science-based management to remove the dead, dying, and dry fuels around just those sequoias. Let's be clear. This is not a slippery slope. This is not about clear cutting. This is not about timber harvesting. This is not about deforestation. What this is about is smart, science-based, circumscribed, and targeted, sensible stewardship of the land surrounding these natural wonders. We must do this now. We must remove these dry fuels, yes, to prevent wildfire, but also to preserve and protect these sequoias for our future, for our progeny. That's why I'm glad to stand here as a group of this bipartisan, behind this bipartisan bill, which will do exactly that. So once again, thank you for being here today. Thank you for your leadership, Leader McCarthy, and it's my honor to introduce Representative Tom McClintock, who understands well what it means to do everything we can to protect these sequoias.
Well, thank you, Congressman Panetta. You know, an untended forest is no different than an untended garden. It'll grow and grow until it chokes itself to death, and then it will succumb to disease, pestilence, drought, and ultimately catastrophic wildfire. That's how nature gardens. And that's what's happening today throughout the Sierra Nevada. Either we carry excess timber out of the forest or nature will burn it out of the forest. We formed the Forest Service 100 years ago to do some gardening, to carry out excess timber, to keep our forests healthy and resilient for every generation to enjoy. And their stewardship reduced fire-destroyed acreage in California from between 4 to 12 million acres a year down to a steady 250,000 acres. But then we passed environmental laws in the 1970s that have made forest management projects infinitely time-consuming and ultimately cost-prohibitive. Our forests have become morbidly overgrown as a result, and nature is again gardening by fire. We were successful in getting a categorical exclusion for forest thinning projects in the Tahoe Basin in 2016. That is what saved the city of South Lake Tahoe from the recent Caldor fire. The fire hit a tract of land treated under that authority. It lay down, and firefighters could extinguish it. This bill effectively extends that authority to protect the sequoias. What we really need is to have that same authority to protect all of the Sierra, in fact, all of our national forests. But for now, I'm pleased to join Leader McCarthy and my colleagues in this effort to save our precious sequoia for future generations.
This bill itself is focused just on the groves. We know the devastation just in the last 3 years, almost 20%. This is devastating to the tree, it's devastating to the environment, the emissions it lets out. But these trees are just so iconic that they can bring a Congress that's divided together. When you think about it for one moment, Bruce Westerman, with a master's in forestry from Yale, Scott Peters, whose political career and his personal career has been about the environment, that they watch, if they do nothing, these trees will no longer be there for a future generation. Teddy Roosevelt also said trees are the lungs of the earth. They bring in CO2, they hold the carbon, they release the oxygen. These are the largest trees on earth. When we were touring, and have you watched this, the devastation, but the beauty of these trees. What's interesting, you watch people from around the country, but not just around the country, around the world come to see them. We are blessed that they're in California, but we cannot sit back. I know there's a lot of politics in D.C. The one thing I will say, there's no politics when it comes to this. We can disagree on other things, but I think all of America can come together, because if Congress does not act, they will no longer be there. And so that's what brought us together. And the uniqueness is so many times bills are written right here, just in a committee. This is different. We could all have our own opinions, but how many times do you see members on both sides of the aisle get in a car together with Forest Service, the Tule Indian River Tribe, with the stakeholders around, and drive grove to grove to have a better understanding, and that we all have the same questions we can ask and hear the same answers. And the one thing that we went away from that day is that we had to act. It's not easy putting something together, but I want to thank the members behind me and those who are on the bill, a number of Republicans, a number of Democrats. And I will tell you, their only priority is to save the groves of the sequoias. With that, let's open it up for some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Leader McCarthy, if President Trump or former President Trump opts to run again in 2024, will you endorse him?
Let me just be clear. If this is going to be something about politics, I got another press conference you can go to. This is a unique situation that we have giant sequoias that have lived for thousands of years. That in the last 3 years, 20% of them have been wiped out. I know you got to do your job, but I would ask one favor. I think the country needs to know about this. There's a lot of other times to ask me questions that could be politics. This is not a stage for that. This is a stage about sequoias. Yes, sir.
It's not about politics, but this is about something in the news. And the last several days,
You'll
there have
get
been
the same answer.
Republican officials have testified that there's been no widespread fraud in
You
the
ever
2020
visited
election.
You want to take
I've
your kids?
seen.
I will bring you on a tour.
But can you
know
can you
what?
can
I'll
you
make this-
say
I'll make
if
it-
you
I'll make
agree
this
that there
pro- I'll make this
was no
promise.
widespread fraud in the
I'll make
2020
this
election?
promise to you. Let's go up on a tour. You bring your cameras. You do a story on that, and then I'll do a live interview with you, any politics you want to, if you run that story. Okay? Thank you. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Josh, a Politico energy reporter. I'm wondering on the piece of this legislation that this is more for Leader McCarthy, maybe Peters, but just, the role that these trees play in absorbing carbon. So, do you consider this a climate piece of legislation? Do you see, I know you got a task force.
Yeah,
Do you see more opportunities to work bipartisan
I hope to, because I think our challenge is great when it comes to the climate. And I think trees are a lot of element that can help us with that. Doesn't solve it all. And Mr. Westman should get up because we worked on 1 trillion trees introduced last Congress, did we not? But just as Congressman Peters, and I'll have him come up here in 1 minute because really he's an environmental attorney. He is focused on saving the environment. That's been his work before in Congress and his work in Congress. And just as he told you in there, a fire is so intense, the emissions that it releases is greater than all the electricity that California has. So you fall back if you do nothing. Then compound that with the majestic beauty of these trees being destroyed. If you want to replant them, and we planted some trees while we were up there, but no one in this room is going to be here 1,000 years later to see it. But maybe our ancestors will if we take action now. So yes, I do believe it's part of helping the environment at the same time. Do you want to take it?
Representative Peters, do you see this as kind of a one-off where interests align, or can you work with, is your sense Republicans share interest in dealing with climate beyond?
So this is a one-off that focuses on icons, environmental icons, that has helped us really build relationships. I mean, I didn't know Bruce Westerman from any of the other Republicans really till we had a conversation about trees. And here I got a real resource here in Congress to help me with forests. We have to have a much larger conversation about wildfires in general. And I think this is the beginning of that. We haven't had that conversation yet. We haven't reached resolution on those bigger issues. But this is a part of that journey. And I think it's very cool that we can get together and as Republicans and Democrats around these iconic trees. And I think it's a start of those conversations. And by the way, it's a good day for bipartisanship. I still support Kevin McCarthy for a minority leader, and he wants he might want me to be ranking member or something. But today's a day to come together and solve this problem.
Remember, the president was just out in the West talking about forest fires. I remember going out touring with incoming Governor Gavin Newsom and Jerry Brown touring these forests. Nobody, Republican or Democrat, if you're in the West, has to deal with fires. They become so intense, as Mr. Panetta said, is so dry. And this could bring us all together, and it could also deal with the climate as well because of the emissions that these fires created. And it doesn't just stay in California. You spend any time across this country in the summer, you'll see the smoke from there as well.
And if you want to talk about natural climate solutions, there's nothing more natural, nothing larger scale, nothing more proactive than having a healthy forest. That's why we introduced the Trillion Trees Act. That's why we're so concerned about taking care of the forest that we have. Leader McCarthy talked about Teddy Roosevelt saying they're the lungs of the earth. They are the natural carbon eaters. And as we see increased levels of carbon in the atmosphere, there's nothing that can pull it out of the atmosphere like a forest can. There's studies that show there are about 3 trillion trees on the planet today. Scientists believe that there's been as many as 7 trillion. If we could regain 1 trillion of those trees, we could pull out 2/3 of the carbon emitted by man since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's large scale, that's proactive, that's economical, and it also helps rural communities, not just in America, but around the world. So there's a lot of positives to forest. And we talk about clean air, but they're critical to clean water. They're critical for wildlife habitat, they're critical for rural economies, and also for recreation. So I've always said forests are a win-win-win situation, and the answer is trees. And what's your question?
And that also includes my Replant Act that was included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a bill that will a bill. It's also about the Replant Act, which was included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which deals with expanding our reforestation efforts in national forests over the next 10 years and creating over close to 10,000 jobs to do that as well.
Which is key. Any other? Yes, sir.
Last question. I am also from California. I've seen the sequoias. They're absolutely gorgeous. I hope they're safe, but this is the normal time for your weekly presser. So I have a question also, like Manu does, about today we're supposed to hear from the front in the hearing that President Trump tried to overthrow the Department of Justice and use it to influence the election and keep himself in office, including some of your own members, as Scott Perry's been mentioned before. How concerning is that to you? And do you regret not appointing anyone?
I do not regret not appointing anybody at all. How can you have an honest investigation if the speaker can appoint and pick and choose who can be on? How can the speaker select a chairman who voted to override a Republican presidential election? And how can a chairman start the whole investigation by saying one person is off limits? How can that person be off limits, the speaker, when the Senate in a bipartisan manner investigated, but the only people who did not work with them or coordinate or collaborate with them was the Speaker's office, the Sergeant of Arms, on what went through that day? So no, that's a political appointment. It's a political committee. And the one thing I do know, and the American public knows, gas has gone up $1.86 a gallon since the day Nancy Pelosi announced that committee. The one thing I'm most proud of, though, today you sat through a press conference about something that you love, an ability to save giant sequoias. I'm going to look forward to your report, knowing that you're from California, knowing what could be lost if nothing happens. And so I welcome your report. I welcome reading it, seeing it, and hearing about it, because this is critical that I think not just every American, but I think people around the world, from our environment to the beauty to the majesticness of these trees. I do not want to be the generation that lost it because they are more concerned about something that politically happened a year ago than it was about what's happening today. And I want to congratulate and thank everybody who's on this bill that can put politics aside and put the priorities that the American public is looking at and the health of the giant sequoias ahead of that. So thank you.